So back to alternatives to incarceration. And with that, we'll start with the first panel of our program. Assessing the landscape, the future of America's criminal legal system, our moderator for this panel is Jeremy Travis. Jeremy is a senior fellow, capital S, capital F. It's not a chronological description, at the Columbia University Justice Lab. Before that, he was among many positions, the director of the New York City Criminal Justice Agency, special counsel to the New York City Police Commissioner, general counsel for the police department, chief counsel to the House Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Criminal Justice, director of the National Institute of Justice, NIJ, a senior fellow at the Urban Institute's Justice Policy Center, and for 13 years, president of the renowned John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Just prior to his current position, Jeremy was senior vice president of criminal justice at Arnold Ventures. And that literally is just the highlights of this man's extraordinary career. I turn it over to Jeremy Travis.
Before I start, I want to, others may feel this in the room also, just ask for a round of applause about what Alan just described of that rescue effort. That's heroic work. Just really, I think you were still absorbing what you said, and the number of people that you were able to bring out of harm's way in Afghanistan, particularly women judges. Wow. Phew. Okay, that was, I just had to sort of acknowledge that. So I'm delighted to be here and to have been asked to moderate this panel. We're going to get into the substance of the discussion this morning in a second, but I have a couple thank yous to offer. One is to the Center on Justice and Human Dignity and to Aleph for sponsoring this. I was at the 2019 conference and was just really impressed then by what I saw and impressed again by what's happened here over the past couple days. And congratulations to the center and to Aleph for bringing on Chris Poulos, who's going to be a great addition to the really an energizer in this work. And a thank you to Hannah Liebman-Dershowitz, who's just been also just a great thought partner. So I got to, this doesn't happen often in life, but I had the fun of being at the 2019 conference, and then when I was at Arnold, one of the names up there, I think, is Arnold Ventures, sort of providing some funding here. So I'm really here to check on my investment and see how things are going, Chris. So far, so good. As moderator, we agreed that one thing I would get to do, sort of privilege of moderator, is to offer some reflections on the day before. So I'm going to do that, if you'll allow me, and then introduce our distinguished, like capital D, distinguished panel. I mean, these are rock stars here. And then we have a discussion underway. We get the luxury of a fair amount of time until we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A, but up till 10:30 for this discussion. So we're going to go pretty deep, I hope, and with your help, because you'll get to ask some questions. So I'm going to offer some thoughts about our first day together. If you were here yesterday, this might resonate with you. But just to put some framing on where we've been at the conference. So so you may think this is a conversation on alternatives to incarceration. It is, but I want to give you some other ways of thinking about the journey we traveled yesterday, and it's by naming three power centers that we discussed and we observed and we experienced yesterday. And when you think about a reform movement, which is where I've sort of devoted my life, you ask, where's the power coming from to create the reform that we desire? And the power is obviously in this room and other people like us who do this work day in, day out. But there are some bigger, higher powers. And I don't mean the higher power, that's there too, but some higher powers that we identified yesterday. So I want to just share what I heard yesterday. The first was the power of voices, power of narrative. And we heard many kinds of voices yesterday that really power this work. One is the voice of redemption. And we heard at the dais here very powerful stories of people who have participated in, been beneficiaries of, clients, whatever the right word is, of the programs. And when we leave at the end of the day tomorrow, end of the day today, We will remember stories of human resilience. And I'll just name some of the folks we heard from yesterday. I hope they're still here because they were great. Richard Fox, who struggled with his bipolar condition. Anderson Taveras, right, who's now a data manager at a national organization. Destiny Garcia, who, in her applause line, I went from homelessness to home ownership in 5 years. That was an amazing story. And then one of my heroes, I don't know if she's still here, but Tara Simmons, to go from struggling down and out, incarcerated, to lawyer, to state representative in the state of Washington, passing legislation that's benefiting the people that she represents, not just who elected her, but the people she represents symbolically. These voices of redemption are really something else, and we need to hold on to them. We also heard the voices of courage, of brave public servants who've gone out of their way, out of their normal day job to sort of do things that are cutting against the grain and to try to make things better for the people that they serve. And we heard a lot of stories from judges. I'm not going to name all of them. Urbanski and Barot and Katara, who have done great, important things by starting programs against all odds. So the voices of these public servants, voices of courage. But we also heard from people in probation, Amina Abdusa Ali, DAs. I worked for Janet Reno for 6 years. Was I lucky or what? But to hear her name come into this room yesterday was really, excuse me for a moment of great power there with Ms. Reno. And then our BOP director, whoa, she just blew me away. She was phenomenal. So the public servants, the voices of courage, but also let's remember that we also heard the voices of pain yesterday. The mother who stood up right here, and before Director Peters left, just stood up. I said, I need to be heard, and then talked about her son and his incarceration. Somebody standing there who recently released from prison who said, I want to speak. I'm the jailhouse lawyer. I'm going to also tell you the names of people still in who should be out, in my view. So the voice of pain is really a part of should be a part of our discussion. So thanks to the folks who organized this effort, that we had formerly incarcerated people, justice-impacted people here to talk about not just the redemption, that's sort of the fun part, if you know what I mean. It's not fun, but it just sort of gives us, makes us feel good. But the voice of pain is what really should keep us going if we're struggling for justice. So the second power that we saw yesterday was the power of research. So that's where I live my life. So it's always great to see research coming to the fore. Gypsy Escobar talking about data, showing the level of conversion cases. Nancy Gertner talking about the power of neuroscience research. Vikrant Reddy here talking about the power of research on the impact of cognitive behavioral therapy. The CARES Act, the releases under the CARES Act. Now there's powerful data about who can be safely released from prison, rearrest rates. Christine Dozier talking about her multi-state study on diversion. Professor Kate Weisberg talking about the mixed research on electronic monitoring. And all of the judges and others who came forward and talked about the data on their program, what the number of people who have benefited. So the power of research, the power of data, a lot more to do, in my view. Sort of what works, what doesn't. But I heard just the end of her keynote, but the power of a concentration on trauma from Dr. Alicia Moreland-Capua. The third power source yesterday that I heard was the power of truth-telling. So I'm doing a lot of work on truth-telling right now. I just came from a conference in New Orleans that's sponsored by the Square One Project at the Justice Lab at Columbia. And this was on a collaborative called the Collaborative on Reckoning and Justice. How do we reckon with our history, particularly the history of racism in the justice system, the history of oppression, the history of the extension of state power, state coercion, deep into our society. And this was brought home to me yesterday by one of my other heroes, Judge Gertner, Judge Nancy Gertner, who's just a truth teller. I can't wait for her book to come out. She's doing something that few judges do, maybe more will, which is to review the cases that she heard where she sentenced people over her, I think, 17-year career on the federal bench. But she also reminded us of, she called it the elephant in the room. Remember that? There are many elephants in many rooms, but the big elephant in this room is that we live now under the shadow of the sentencing guidelines. 40 years ago, she said, before we even thought about mass incarceration, before we thought about Black Lives Matter, before we thought about the omnipresence of criminal records, before we thought about, in a sort of systematic way, the ways in which the reach of state power has challenged our very democracy. So she's reminding us that we need to not just focus on the right now, but on how we got here. You may know that one of the things I did was to chair the National Academy of Sciences panel on how did we come to the era of mass incarceration. This is a deep history lesson about how the tough on crime era, what she called the moral panic, which is what we experienced as a country 40 years ago, how that brought us to this current day, where alternatives to incarceration, still 1%, she reminds us of the state cases, is just this fragile flower in the shadow of punitive excess, whether it's supervision, Vinny's book got a shout-out yesterday, or mass incarceration, or stop and frisk policing, the ways in which the state has intruded on the lives of so many people. That sort of state of our democracy, that truth-telling is very important. There's also truth-telling about how hard it is to do this work and get budgets. I love, sort of, I used to be a bureaucrat and worry about this stuff. How do you get money out of government, right? That's really, really hard. So we need to get people to pay attention and to take what's being talked about here and make this the norm rather than the exception. Make this Judge Gardner says, why doesn't this influence our thinking about probation? Why doesn't this influence our thinking about sentencing? So we need to have a bigger, more robust discussion that we started yesterday. So lots of work ahead, and today we're going to focus on, from these brave public servants, what is happening in thinking about alternatives to incarceration as getting closer to the norm. What programs are working, which ones are not, and how do we replicate them? We have some people here who are going to talk about some of the successes in our world as well as the challenges. So I'm going to introduce all of them, and then we'll start in the order in which they're introduced. It's here somewhere. Where are you? I know your first name. There we go. Okay, Jeremy Fogel is Executive Director of the Berkeley Judicial Institute at Berkeley Law School. Has a long history known, I'm certain, to most of you. He was at the Federal Judicial Center as its director for 7 years, also district judge in California, founding district attorney of the Mental Health Advocacy Project, a very important project in the late 1970s. And he is a national expert thinking about precisely these issues and has published and lectured significantly. And so we'll hear from Jeremy Fogel. So join me in welcoming him first, and then we'll hear next from, to his left, Brent Cohen, who is, so I used to work at the Justice Department, so I get to say this. He's the acting principal deputy assistant attorney general, known affectionately as PDAG. He's a PDAG. You are in the presence of a PDAG. Acting still? Acting still. Oh, okay. We'll get rid of that at some point. He's worked at the Center for American Progress as a vice president for youth engagement. Was a White House fellow. I know Brent because he was a mover and a shaker in city government in New York City at the probation department and the corrections department, working for our friend Marty Horn. Now he works for another good friend, Amy Solomon, one of my other heroes. We're going to hear from Judge Phil Restrepo, who is now on the bench, 2 benches of the Sentencing Commission and the Third Circuit. Another important figure in our judicial circles, who has been honored for his work on the reentry program that we'll hear about, the STAR program. But has just a remarkable record of public service and intellectual contributions to our field. And we'll have, I'm sure, something to say also about the work of the Sentencing Commission. What I hadn't known about him was that he was a partner in the firm of Krasner and Restrepo. I know the first word in that firm because Mr. Krasner is another person I admire. And Jacqueline Romero will also be on our panel. She's the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District and came of age basically in that office where you served for 16 years. Also very deeply involved in the STAR program, which we want to hear a lot about, one of the longest standing reentry programs in the country. public service in the Treasury Department, public service in the Civil Division of the Justice Department, honored by the Hispanic Bar Association of Pennsylvania, the board of the LGBTQ Bar Association of Philadelphia, and a very prominent voice on behalf of alternatives to incarceration. So please join me in welcoming everybody. I know I welcomed Jeremy first, but we'll get going. So here are the rules. Each of them is going to speak for 5 or 7 minutes or so about the topic of their choosing. We had a pre-meet, so we sort of know where we're going. Most important, I think, will be I'm going to encourage some cross-panel discussion. Ask each of them to ask one of their panelists a question, so it's not all coming from here. And then we'll save 10 or 15 minutes to the end for questions from you. Is that a deal? Sound good? Okay, let's go.
I'm up, and it's great to see everyone. Really great to be here. And my role is to give a bit of an overview as to what everyone else is going to talk about. So, there are traditionally a number of purposes of sentencing. If you look at the codes of the federal government, states. So public safety, right, protect public safety, deterrence of crime, retribution/punishment, and what has been called historically rehabilitation, although we already heard that is a concept that needs to be rethought. But anyway, those are the things that you hear about mostly with regard to why we sentence people. I don't need to tell anyone here that our criminal system is enormously overweighted in the direction of retribution. Of all of the industrial societies in the world, save ones like Russia and Iran and so forth, but I mean at least the democratic-leaning countries or democratic countries, we have by far the most retributive criminal system. And it's just a given culturally. It's hard to get people's heads out of that as to, well, what would something else look like? The idea is, well, you're punishing people for doing something bad. And you're also getting them out of sight and out of mind. I mean, that's what happens when you put people in prison, except for the families and the loved ones of the people who are put away. And the thing about it is, we know from data, and back to what Mr. Travis was just saying, we know from data that our heavy emphasis on retribution really hasn't done much to improve public safety. We still have a lot of crime. There really hasn't been a big impact on crime from greater reliance on retribution. There really isn't much impact on deterrence, because usually when people commit crimes, they know that they could get in trouble and it doesn't stop them. And raising the penalty really doesn't seem to make a lot of difference, and the data tend to point in that direction. In terms of what we have called historically rehabilitation, it's been very cramped. It's been, the point here is to keep people from committing crimes again. It has nothing to do with the quality of their lives. It has nothing to do with the underlying sources of why they got in trouble in the first place. It's simply imposing rules on people and saying, we're going to watch you so carefully that, if you look somebody cross-eyed, you're going to go back to prison. And that's what we really think of in terms of rehabilitation. And so what we're together to talk about is nothing short of a paradigm shift. It's really thinking differently about why we have this system in the first place. And I thought that Professor Morland-Capuilla's talk yesterday was wonderful in so many ways. And I think that one of the things that I found particularly compelling about it was that she talked about looking at people and looking at human situations in terms of trauma. That the people who commit crimes or get accused of crimes usually have suffered from trauma. The people who crimes are committed against, if it's a crime involving a victim, experience trauma. The family members of people who end up in the criminal justice system, they experience trauma. And as the professor pointed out, we all experience trauma. The judges and the probation officers and prosecutors and defenders and everybody who is part of that system experiences vicarious trauma when we see this repetitive cycle of pain and suffering going on before us. I will take 30 seconds. This is a story I've told a lot of people who I know here have heard this story, but I was in the state court, and I was responsible for settling felony cases. In my state, judges can be involved in plea bargaining. And I was good at it. I was a good mediator, and I settled lots and lots of criminal cases. They were all felonies, and everybody was happy because they were getting cases disposed of, and the pleas were getting taken. And I remember about 3 or 4 months into it, and if you know me, I'm just an incurably optimistic person. I have a very upbeat view of human nature. And I came home from work one day, and I walked into my house, and I said to my wife, "People suck." Because it was just the impact of seeing all of that over and over again, and people doing self-destructive things, and people doing things that were hard on other people, and just the secondary trauma, the stress of seeing that finally caught up with me. So we need to see what's going on with us in terms of trauma, and I thought that's what was so useful about that presentation. And then how do you respond to it? And this is where we start talking about alternatives to incarceration. So, the FJC did a study, and I think we have some material in the handouts, where they studied reentry programs that were based on intensive supervision. The whole theory of the program was, we're going to intensively supervise you and keep you out of trouble. Guess what? Those programs did not really reduce recidivism. They were really quite unsuccessful, given the resources that were put into them. But then we'll hear about the STAR program, we'll hear about other programs like it, where you have a multidisciplinary approach which is based on dealing with the pain of the people involved and bringing to bear mental health resources and medical resources and employment resources and social work resources and legal resources. But it's a very holistic, to use a California word, it's a very holistic approach to how you deal with the human beings who are in the program. And I'll just end my opening remarks by saying that way back in the 1970s, when I started the Mental Health Advocacy Project, I had clients who were the most vulnerable people in the entire criminal justice system. They couldn't express themselves. They scared people to death. I really appreciated those comments yesterday, because they would tend to be very emotional and act out, and they would be delusional. And yet they had problems that needed representation, and we were trying to figure out how to deal with them. And the only way we could do that was a multidisciplinary approach. We had to bring in people who could see all of the different angles of human life. We have to get out of this kind of box of legal rules and guidelines and procedures, and not that those things are irrelevant, but they're only one data point in a much broader picture. And my contribution to start this panel is simply, if we're talking about going forward and what things are going to look like downstream, we got to open up our minds, and we got to see all of these different things that go back to the trauma that people suffer.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Brent?
Thank you, Jeremy, and good morning, everyone. Glad to be with you. I'm going to start on actually kicking off from the last point where Judge Fogel left off about trauma. And in 2008, I think it was, I was at Rikers Island in New York City, specifically in the wing of the RNDC jail, where we had 16, 17, and 18-year-olds. At the time, New York had not yet raised the age. And so kids, when they turned the age of 16, if they were incarcerated pre-trial, they went to Rikers. Rikers is not an appropriate place for children. Frankly, adult jails are not appropriate places for children, period. And I remember being there. We had a special guest, who was doing a book reading. He had been incarcerated as a kid himself, and we were talking with the young people in the facility. And the deputy commissioner who was with us at the time asked the kids, "How many of you have been victims of crime?" Nobody raised their hand. Not one kid in that facility raised their hand. And then she asked the same question, but asked it differently. How many of you have been robbed? How many of you had a gun pulled on you? How many of you have been in a fight and started piecing out, and you saw hands start going up? Kids in those facilities didn't identify themselves as victims, and for good reason. but that doesn't mean they hadn't been victimized. It didn't mean that they hadn't experienced trauma, and certainly Rikers wasn't the place where that trauma was going to be addressed, where they were going to receive the help that they needed. And we knew that for the vast majority, again, young people shouldn't be in adult jails, period. But for the vast majority of those kids, they shouldn't be in any facility either. That in order for us to address their trauma, in order for us to really respond to what was driving the behavior that led them to that facility to begin with, it wasn't going to occur inside of a locked setting. So the question of this panel is really talking about the future of the landscape here, and we're in a little bit of a unique position at the Office of Justice Programs within DOJ. With OJP, as we call it, we've got 6 program offices, Bureau of Justice Assistance, OJJDP, which focuses on juvenile justice and delinquency prevention, the Office for Victims of Crime, which provides most of the nation's federal funding around supporting victims. And we also have the National Institute of Justice that Jeremy led, as well as the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the research and statistical arms of the department, respectively. And so we are identifying as best as we can within the authorizations and appropriations of Congress what works in the criminal justice field. We are literally funding those programs at a state and local level, and then we are researching them and tracking the data to see what happens. So just this year, fiscal year 23, we provided more than $50 million to states and cities specifically to assist law enforcement agencies in addressing challenges posed by the mental health crisis that our nation is experiencing. So this looks like supporting activities to improve crisis response, co-responder models, community responder models, so that when someone's in behavioral health crisis, a mental health team responds either in complement to a law enforcement response or even instead of. Having certified community behavioral health clinics and crisis stabilization centers to be able to provide supports in communities to people who are experiencing a behavioral health crisis, again, so that we are not moving this all upstream, where often law enforcement agencies, absent this type of funding, absent this type of work, have one response, unfortunately. And that's not a knock on police or law enforcement. It's simply what is at their disposal, which is arrest. And arrest leads to, oftentimes, incarceration, whether it's for 24 hours or a longer period of time. And so we're working with law enforcement agencies across the country to say, how do you recognize when someone's in a behavioral health crisis? What is the appropriate community response, either in addition to and complement to or instead of a traditional law enforcement response? We're implementing training programs for law enforcement officers, law enforcement agencies, sheriff's departments. There's a crisis response and intervention training curriculum that's being used across the country. And so all of this is happening on the diversion and deflection side. And I'm speaking specifically just in the behavioral health context, but certainly we know diversion and deflection, diversion in particular outside of behavioral health, is a really critical component in terms of, as we talk about alternatives to incarceration, it's not just at the sentencing phase, but it's further upstream. How do we prevent someone from even getting through that formal front door of the system when that's not the appropriate place for them, if it's not the appropriate place for them? Judge Fogel talked a bit about intensive supervision and how the research and data you saw on at least some of those programs didn't necessarily lead to reductions in incarceration or perhaps improvements in outcomes. And that's consistent certainly with what we've seen in research looking at the type of probation or supervision programs that aren't addressing some of the root causes here. The first 18 to 24 months are often the most impactful. And after that, it can serve as a tripwire to incarceration. And so being really thoughtful about how do we make sure the alternative sentences that are being imposed are being more effective in a community-based setting, are reducing recidivism, are improving community safety, and not just delaying an inevitable entrance into a jail or a prison setting. And I'll say on that piece here quickly, and then I'll begin to wrap up, is progress isn't linear. All of us know that. All of us know that. Progress isn't linear, especially when we're talking about young adults, also when we're talking about older adults. When people are overcoming years of habits, to expect someone to go from 0 to 100 is not a reasonable expectation. It's not reasonable for children, it's not reasonable for adults. Anyone who's tried to exercise before, after a spell of not having exercised,
No, you can stop right there. That's it. But you were doing fine. Then you were talking about us.
now I made it personal, right? I mean, progress isn't linear. And so we shouldn't expect progress to be linear for those people who are trying to overcome years of habits. And so, anyhow, I'll zoom out for one very quick second. And I brought it upstream to diversion and deflection at that point of initial police interaction. But it's even beyond that if we zoom out further. And we talk about community safety and empowering community members as co-producers of public safety, working side by side in complement to law enforcement to really be co-producers of public safety. And over the last 2 years, we've invested nearly $200 million into community violence intervention and prevention, some of which funded by the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And so it's a recognition that community members and community-based organizations have a vital role in addressing, reducing, intervening in violence before it leads to police interaction, before it leads to an incarceration sentence. And so thinking about this, yes, rewriting the sentence is critically important, and also I'd offer backing up that conversation even further and zooming out to how do we prevent some of this from occurring to begin with.
Thanks very much, Brent. We're going to want to hold on to this observation about safety and mental health and trauma. We'll come back to that in a second. But Ms. Romero, your perspectives on this issue from your current and former positions.
Sure. I'm here to talk about the STAR reentry program, and what in every crowd that I've ever been in, the big question that I get from folks is, what does a U.S. attorney have to say about reentry? Your job is to lock people up. It is to stand up for the rights of victims, and you need to stay in your lane. Reentry is about social services, and what could the U.S. attorney possibly have to say about this topic? Have a lot to say about it because the basic premise that we'll start with is I'm never going to prosecute my way out of the crime problem in a city like Philadelphia. It's completely impossible. I can focus on data-driven, impactful prosecutions of large organizations, disrupt, dismantle, and do all the things that are in my power to do, but I'm not going to prosecute my way out of the crime problem. I have several of my prosecutors are here in the room today, and they'll tell you they have prosecuted generations of individuals. They had the grandfather for certain crimes, then the father, and then the son. And so how do we deal with that cycle? And that's what the STAR reentry program is about. Back in 2007, our people who are much smarter than me, including Judge Restrepo here, decided to start the federal reentry program in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. And the idea behind the program was to target the sort of mid-level criminals, the folks on what we call a PICRA score, the risk assessment, who are in that mid-level. It's a scores of 0 to 9, and these are your sort of 5, 6, 7s on that scale. Why the mid-level folks? Because the research shows that the very low offenders are probably going to figure it out and get out of the system. The really high offenders are very hard to reach. These are people who have been highly traumatized, and it's really hard to change their way of thinking. But if we could focus on these mid-level offenders, this was the premise, and it's a genius premise. If we can focus on these mid-level folks and give them some heightened resources and stay with them through a program where they eventually graduate the program, we can have an impact on communities. Because if these folks, when we say mid-level, you're talking about armed robberies. These are some folks who have committed some really horrible crimes, right? Some violent crimes. If they go back to their communities and they don't turn it around, they're going to go to a volatile community and make it even more volatile. We're going to see that same generational, criminal thinking over and over again, and we're going to have that cycle of just locking people up. But if we can turn them around, we're not only affecting them, hopefully we're affecting generations, their kids, their grandkids, et cetera, and we're also affecting their communities because their neighbors are starting to see these folks come home from a decent paying job, have a life with their kids, doing pro-social behaviors, and they're like, what are you drinking? I want some of that. And that was the concept behind reentry when we started it back in 2007. What I can say is that in 2007, the recidivism rate for folks in this mid-level category was 48%. Folks who've gone through our reentry program and have graduated, the recidivism rate has remained steady at 13%. Do the math for a minute. Your average incarcerated individual, $35,000 a year. So when people tell me this is social work, I said, you know what we have saved? The Eastern District of Pennsylvania, the millions of dollars in prison incarceration fees over the life of this program, over 15 years now. It's incredible. Do you know the time that I have saved my AUSAs who are not sitting in revocation hearings and having to deal with revocation? They can actually be on the line prosecuting the data-driven, complex, impactful cases that I need them to be prosecuting. This is prevention work at its best, and it's effective. So that's where I come from as a prosecutor in terms of supporting this program and putting resources and people on the program. Judge Restrepo is going to tell you more about how the program works, the nuts and bolts. I don't want to steal his steam. But I want to give you the prosecutor's perspective on this. It works. We've seen it. I've seen it. I was assigned to reentry court, Judge Rice's, Magistrate Judge Tim Rice's reentry court for the greater part of a decade. And I saw people come through that program, people that you would have given up on as society. These are folks who took guns and did some pretty rough things, right? Some of them were enforcers in drug organizations, some pretty rough people coming through this program. I saw one individual get his welding degree, and he does underwater diving welding for a living. He's making more money than I do. I saw several individuals publish books. Many folks just get normal, everyday jobs that they could provide for their family, and they're coming into reentry even after they've graduated with grandkids on their hips, smiling, just checking in. Judge, I don't even need to be here, but I just came back to say hello. Is there anything I can do for the guys in the program? It is powerful stuff. You go to a reentry graduation. This sounds woo-woo from a federal prosecutor, right? But sit through a reentry graduation and see folks who've never been to a graduation in their lives. This is their very first graduation. They made it through the 52 weeks of the program. And they bring their entire family and grandkids. And it is just a celebratory event. It is the biggest thing that they have done in their lives. And even they are surprised that they haven't gone back to prison in those 52 weeks. It's just really incredible stuff. There are some failures in the program. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We do have folks that offend, maybe get rearrested. A lot of them are actually our biggest success stories. We had one guy who was rearrested, went back to prison, came back to reentry, and said, I still want to be in the program afterwards. And he eventually went and was hired by the Third Circuit Court of Appeals as a clerk there. So it has just been incredible. What I will say is the old model of reentry went like this. I'm an AUSA. I prosecute a case, I get my great conviction, someone goes away for 20 years. And in many cases, don't get me wrong, that is a great thing, because there are people who have done some horrific things and belong in prison. Person gets out 20 years from now. I'm still in AUSA, because our office is so great, people stay there for 30 or 40 years. And I haven't heard anything about this person in that many years, and hopefully I'll never see them again, right? But the only time I get to see them again is at the revocation table. That's the old model. We're back, he's back, we're gonna send him back to prison. The new model is that person gets out of prison, and we follow them for 52 weeks. We're with them every 2 weeks. Every time there is a minor infraction, we hear about it. And as we all know, crime is a continuum, right? It starts with a little lie here, missed probation meeting here, starting to hang out with the wrong folks here, mouthing off to my employer here if I have an employer, and it starts to escalate. But during those 52 weeks, we all sit at the table and we have an opportunity as prosecutors. I have folks who sit there in these sessions. We have pre-sessions, and Judge Restrepo will illuminate that a little bit more. And our prosecutors say, whoa, 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 I don't like what I'm hearing from probation. What can we do to turn this person around? They haven't been employed in 7 weeks. They've had ample opportunity to get employment. We've thrown employment opportunities at them. They missed their appointments, et cetera. What can we do? We could put them on house arrest. That's like the worst possible thing, right, for someone. Maybe we start out with they've got to go and volunteer. That's it, mandatory volunteer service. They hate that too. It's unpaid time that they have to go and be somewhere. I might as well go get a job. So we have graduated ways of swaying people to the things that are actually good for them that they don't realize are good for them. And a lot more other things that services, cognitive behavioral therapy, and things that we can throw at them because we have them in an organized program that can address those sort of needs. So we've sort of changed the model in a lot of ways. It doesn't cost us much. We have community partners that bring resources. We have law students who want to work with these folks and help them write resumes and do the things that they need to do. We have incredible reentry coordinators. Mine, Cindy Zeidema, is here. Please give a wave, Cindy. I want to give credit where credit's due. Cindy's been with our program for more than a decade. She has been a force of nature, building community relationships, finding resources, housing, employment, all the kinds of things that our folks need coming through reentry. And it's just an incredible new model where, as prosecutors, we're not blind anymore. We're not just showing up for the revocation hearing. We have many, many steps along the way where we can help build someone and steer them in the right direction so that we don't have to ever sit at that revocation hearing. So I've said plenty. Judge Restrepo is going to give more the nuts and bolts of how the court works. He's been with it since the beginning. And can I get a round of applause because he really was the champion of reentry early on.
You're too kind, Jackie or U.S. Attorney Romero. So I'm wearing two hats here. We'll start with my position, as it were, with the U.S. Sentencing Commission in terms of alternatives to incarceration. So the commission, as you may know, recently, well, about a year ago, we established a quorum. President Biden nominated 7 of us, and we were able to get through. And we've been meeting regularly ever since. And the current amendment cycle, the past amendment cycle, The amendments will go to Congress. They went to Congress, and if nothing happens between now and November 1st, they'll be written into the guidelines. And there's some important aspects of these amendments that really touch on alternatives to incarceration. The compassionate release guidelines were rewritten, and they've expanded what criteria judges should look to in terms of when they're evaluating compassionate release petitions, very much expanded. Status points were revisited and were eliminated in large numbers because we realized there was really very little correlation between status. Those are points you get if you're, before you're sentenced, if you were under supervision at the time. Because the statistics showed that there was very low correlation between status points and recidivism, so we took them off the board. We also made that retroactive, so it's going to impact quite a few folks that are currently in custody in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And we created a new guideline or concept known as a 0-point offender, which if you are sentenced and you're a true 0-point offender, meaning that you have no criminal history points as defined by the guidelines, there's a new category because the statistics showed that 0-point offenders are much less likely to recidivate than anybody else. So the way we balance that is if you're a true 0-point offender, you will have 2 points taken off of your offense category, again, reducing your exposure under the guidelines. We've also created a link, and in the current amendment cycle, we're studying alternatives to incarceration, and we created a link on the USSC webpage that is, in essence, a clearinghouse for folks that are interested in alternatives to incarceration, different programs across the country. So that's what I have to offer by way of my position as a vice chair on the Sentencing Commission. But I want to follow up on what Jackie said about our reentry program. I've been doing reentry in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania since we started in 2006, 2007. I did it as a magistrate judge, I did it as a district court judge, and I'm doing it as a circuit judge. And I'm often asked, why you do this? And the answer is, it is by far the most meaningful thing I've done as an attorney or as a judge. Nothing else even, there's no close second, quite frankly. The work is really interesting, and I think it's really meaningful and impactful. And the way it works from 30,000 feet is an individual is released from the Bureau of Prisons, or they're sent to a halfway house. We have 2 halfway houses in Philly. We have a probation officer embedded at the halfway house. He identifies folks that meet the criteria. Jackie touched on it. They're medium to high-risk violent offenders. They're referred to the program. We ask them to come watch one of the sessions before they actually sign the contract to enroll in the program. I meet with my cadre of participants every other Tuesday morning. There's a different judge that meets on alternate Wednesdays in the afternoons. We meet in the mornings and in the afternoons to accommodate individuals' work schedules, but they're assigned to one of the 2 different cadres. Before I go to court, I get a report the night before from the U.S. probation officer assigned to my group that gives me a summary of what's been going on in their lives over the last 2 weeks. We meet in the meetings. It's a large meeting. It's myself, the U.S. probation officer, members from the U.S. Attorney's Office, the federal defenders, U.S. probation, and a lot of volunteers. We have partnered with all the big firms and many, many sole practitioners in Philadelphia that provide legal assistance to our clients on collateral issues impacting their reintegration. The students work with the practicing attorneys under the 3rd-year practice rule. The students are there, and they're there ready to meet with our participants in a real time with respect to the different issues they're confronting. It's typically fines and costs, family issues, landlord-tenant issues, identity theft, anything other than a new criminal case. We will provide free legal representation. This is high-quality legal representation amongst the best lawyers in Philadelphia. People want to help. People want to get involved. That's one thing I've learned over the years. If you give people an opportunity to help in a meaningful way, they'll be there for you. We also have folks, among our other significant partners would be the Philadelphia Housing Authority. Years ago, Judge Rice and I met with the PHA, which is the Philadelphia Housing Authority. They offered us 10 scattered sites, Section 8 housing vouchers. We now have 30 vouchers given to the program by way of PHA. And what we do with these vouchers is we offer them to the participants for a 2-year run, and we ask them to recycle them to the program so the next guy up can take advantage of the voucher. Jackie touched on the CBT program. We have a partnership with Drexel University. Their students needed hours, their therapists needed hours, our participants needed therapy, so it's a win-win, and they are incredibly helpful and incredibly accommodating. We incentivize this program by offering folks extra credit towards graduation if they participate in the program. We found that it works best if we introduce them to CBT while they're still in the halfway house. Folks are always looking for a reason to leave the halfway house, and so it was easier to convince folks to participate in CBT while they were still in the halfway house as opposed to while they were on the street. A few other partners, and I can't name them all, I'd be here all afternoon. The Philadelphia Lawyers for Social Equity, they run expungement clinics for our participants. We have a great partnership with the Temple Fox School of Business. They're undergraduates. It's an honors program for the undergraduates, and they offer financial literacy, tutoring really, to our participants. One of the district court judges, Judge McHugh, established a fund to help with expenses that aren't covered by probation. The private bars contributed significantly to that fund. Over the years, we've distributed more than $50,000. The judges don't decide who gets these funds. We have committees from the two different court sessions that take the applications into consideration and distribute funds on an as-needed basis. We have partnered with folks from the Circuit Executive's Office to offer tutoring. We learned that a lot of our guys were not doing well on the GED exams and the CDL exams, and we realized that if we offered them tutoring up front before they took the test, we had much more success passing these exams. So we have a lot of folks that have volunteered to tutor our participants. They tutor them in the courthouse. So it's really an organic program. We've had folks from a lot of different jurisdictions come and ask or watch what we do and say, how can we do this? As recently as last week, the Eastern District of New York was there. They're about to open a reentry court model after our program. And what I tell folks is you have to be patient. You got to walk before you can run. To be patient with yourself and with the participants, that it's really important that the folks in the room are all working in a collaborative spirit. I mean, you're all pushing the rock up the hill together. This is not an adversarial system. This is a very unique type program. So it's kind of personality driven. You need to have the right folks in the room that all have the same end game in mind. And the most important thing I tell them is don't make any promises you can't keep, because you lose credibility with the participants. What we do is if we tell somebody that we're going to help them with their driver's license issue or we're going to help them find housing, we do it. And it takes a lot of effort. Not so much, I have the easiest job in the room. It's folks like Cindy and others that do the heavy lifting for us. It's been a success. When we first started this program, there was a lot of pushback from judges asking me, why are you doing this? It's like a hug a thug type program. You're not a social worker. But we were fortunate enough early in the program to come across a young PhD student at Drexel who was looking for a dissertation topic, and we needed empirical evidence to show that this was working. So we partnered with her. She wrote a thesis. It's been published. It's been peer-reviewed. The statistics Jackie referenced earlier are legitimate. They're not cooked up by anybody in my office or the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're run by a woman named Caitlin Taylor, who's now a professor at LaSalle University. She helps us every year update the numbers. So we have the empirical data, and the program, knock on wood, it's working. And in terms of what Jeremy said earlier and what Jackie touched on, this is public safety writ large. I mean, what's more, how can you, if folks aren't committing crimes, that's public safety. And from the deterrence perspective, we deal with the violations in real time. In other words, if we find out that somebody's giving us a dirty urine or is not cooperating with the probation officer, we can impose sanctions immediately. Which is very different than the traditional model where you have a petition sent to a judge. The judge has to schedule it, and it could take weeks. And that's not nearly as effective as what we're doing with the real-time resolution of these offenses. And folks, anybody in this room, we all know that the system's broken. I mean, where else, is there any place else in the world where you'd have a 50% failure rate and you'd keep doing the same thing? It's crazy. So this is our effort to try to move the needle.
I want to come back to Judge Fogel. You mentioned before that we might be in need of a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And that we'd lost the focus of rehabilitation. Right. And that we've ramped up incarceration as our retributive response to everything. Right. What you're hearing,
well,
something like that paradigm?
I mean, I'm biased because I think the START program is wonderful. And I thought the START program is wonderful for a really long time. It's a model. And I want to just say two things. Judge Restrepo mentioned, he gets pushback from judges, we're not social workers. Hey, guess what? This is social work. I mean, it is. And there's nothing to be embarrassed about there. This is, you're looking at people, if you listen to what both Ms. Romero and Judge Restrepo said, it's very granular, right? This is not some big thing, we're going to, punish evil and, put people. I mean, it's all about public safety, actually, and about deterrence and about preventing recidivism. That's the end goal. But the way you get there is, you help people with their driver's license. You help people with their job. You help people with their housing. You help people with their health care issues. You help people if they're having trouble at home, and they're not getting along with their family. I mean, that's what's so great about this program. It's kind of you're really looking at people where they are in their life in a very granular way. And both of my aunts and my grandmother were all social workers. So I actually have a lot of respect for social workers who do the job well. And this is a way of taking what you've learned from that profession and the work that they do and applying it in the criminal context. And the data shows that it actually makes a huge difference. We found that this was true with our mental health clients, and these were people who, some of them were diagnosed schizophrenics. They were people who were getting in and out of one kind of custody or another, whether it was the mental health system or the criminal system. And we couldn't treat the schizophrenia, but what we could do is we could look at what the downstream effects of it were. And if somebody had a safe place to live, or they had they had something to do with their time during the day, or if they had a better relationship with their caregiver, their lives got better. It was just sort of the focus on the granularity of it all. And that's what I heard here that was so inspiring to me. And these are the programs that I think are the future. I think that's the way we need to go.
So I said I'd like to open the mic to anybody on the panel to ask anyone else on the panel a question or make an observation, and you just saw modeled behavior of exactly what I hoped for. I could ask all day, but I'd love to hear what you're hearing and what you'd like to ask your co-panelists about.
If I might, just to highlight one point that both U.S. Attorney Romero and Judge Restrepo mentioned, which is the population being served by the program. And I think that's a critical point that I want to highlight, because so often programs go afield because they're targeting the wrong populations. Folks who are unlikely to recidivate, who score as low risk, do not need intensive supports. They need the justice system to let them go be fine. The justice system putting unnecessary hands, for lack of a better term, on people who are unlikely to return to the system anyway increases their likelihood of recidivism. And so identifying medium to high risk individuals, and I love the fact that you're specifically working with people, or at least including people with violent convictions, is hugely important. Too often the narrative in this country when we talk about whether it's front-end engagement and diversion programs or back-end reentry programs is, oh, well, we don't work with people with violent convictions. Well, why not? If you want to be successful, if you want to make an impact, work with people who are medium to high risk with violent convictions. That is, in fact, the target population. And so I applaud you for having that population, and I wanted to highlight that because it's such a critical point on the success of the program and when we think about really increasing community safety.
One of the things I also wanted to add that we didn't address is how this reentry program has also just solidified our relationships and the entire system. We come together every couple of weeks, the federal judges, the federal defenders, U.S. Attorney's Office, our probation office, community volunteers, U.S. Marshals are involved, Bureau of Prisons is involved on some levels. This program over the years has created a relationship amongst us in the Eastern District that I think is incredible. When we had, for instance, the pandemic and courthouse having to shut down, it affects us, it affects probation, it affects the defenders. we were able to quickly galvanize, have a meeting, and all agree very quickly on how we were going to triage things, what was the fair way to proceed. There wasn't the kind of animosity that you would normally have in a lot of districts between U.S. Attorney's Office, defenders, et cetera, because we're used to working with
Was
one
that the STAR
another.
program that was the catalyst in that?
I think it has
that worked?
created better relationships, is my point. There are ripple effects to the program in our entire district because we are constantly coming together at problem solving and coming together as professionals, not necessarily all adversaries.
So in our prep call, Ms. Romero, we had this discussion about culture change. So many pilot programs are sort of work at the margins. They struggle. They're successful or not, but they don't necessarily achieve that sort of impact across. I mean, you mentioned a working group basically, or a culture, and you were talking about the acceptance level with judges for this. So if you just comment on that a little bit, I'd love to hear more about that, and maybe Judge Restrepo can add to it.
Did you want to? Okay.
That's why he's so good. He gives.
Well,
gives it
no,
away.
I think it's been a tremendous cultural change. So when we first started, not everybody was on board with the program, and including probation. These were hard sells of why would probation want to give up its power of being the only one to supervise individuals? That's our job. You know, we had to have a lot of meetings early on to kind of talk through those dynamics. And it had to be a huge cultural shift, but it wasn't overnight. It was something over time. There were many federal judges who thought this is woo-woo work, the social work. Why are we getting involved, you know, as a court? That's not our place. It's not the U.S. Attorney's place, et cetera. And we had to really go slow in the beginning and show results, which is why I think it's so important that early on the judges engaged a statistician, you know, a researcher, somebody who could follow this program and really prove it up. Because you can't argue against the statistics. They're evidence-based, data-driven statistics. And over time now, I've seen judges who were really adamantly against the program change their tune. And sometimes all it took was inviting them to a graduation where the person they had sentenced is now in reentry talking about how they rekindled their relationship with their kids and their former spouse, and they've had a decent paying job for so many months. They went through cognitive behavioral therapy, and they talk about their successes during reentry court, and these judges have seen it firsthand. Wow, this person who I may have written off years ago has really turned it around. So there's been a lot of cultural changes. I'll let Judge Restrepo.
Yeah, another one of the, we took a field trip. Back up a step. So we partnered with a Quaker group in Philadelphia that was rehabbing homes in distressed neighborhoods. Our guys wanted to learn the trades, so we tried to figure out a way to do a partnership. Every district court in the country has a big slush fund. If you don't know about it, you should, all right? And so we were able to get $100,000 from the Eastern District of Pennsylvania to partner with the Quaker organization, and the way we did it was we would use that $100,000 to buy building materials and supplies. We cleared this with the AO. It had to be a non-appropriated line item, and there's no appropriation for building materials and supplies. So we were able to get $100,000 from the district court. They hired our guys, paid them a real wage, and taught them the trade skills. And they rehabbed homes in distressed neighborhoods. Some of them lived in these homes. Many of them just did this for the job training. It was an example of one of the partnerships we had. And we did get a lot of pushback. It wasn't easy getting this money out of the district court, but we took a field trip, and we took some of the, I don't want to say haters, but I'll say it, right? We took some of them on the field trip, and what they saw, I think, blew them away. And they went back and told their colleagues that this is working. This is really, it's a good investment. And so it was an example of how we partnered with a nonprofit. Our guys needed some help. They needed some money. It worked, and it really, it brought along a lot of judges on board. One thing I didn't touch on is the importance of the court sessions. So the court sessions are really important because at the end of the day, it's probably maybe the first place a lot of these individuals felt where it was safe for them to ask for help, and it was safe for them to feel vulnerable. These are proud guys, And again, we're dealing with guys who have violent criminal histories. Many of these folks have been institutionalized since they were very young. And it's the first time that they felt, look, I'm comfortable asking for help, notwithstanding the fact that there's a judge up on the bench, but I realize that other guys are asking for help, and people are supportive here. And I think that goes a long ways towards helping them make the transition back into the community.
Judge Restrepo, can I ask you to go out on a limb, and you may or may not want me to saw it off? You want to give us a view of the future discussions within the Sentencing Commission on this topic of alternatives?
That's tough to say, right? I mean, because it's one of the topics on the current amendment cycle, and the way the Sentencing Commission works is we're going to have public hearings on this, and we're going to solicit comments. So anybody in this room is more than welcome to go to the portal. There's a link where you can send us your thoughts, suggestions, critiques, whatever you like, and we welcome them all. But this is one of the topics we have under consideration. We can't tell judges what to do by way of back-end or front-end programs. All we can do is maybe cajole them and show them that what's possible. And I think that's, at the end of the day, that's where we're headed this amendment cycle.
I'm going to make one more observation, then you all get your questions ready for this distinguished panel. So Judge Gertner yesterday encouraged us to think about the relationship between this conversation, what she called the 1%, sort of the alternatives, and probation, what she called standard, or I forget her classic probation, and sentencing to incarceration. So these are alternatives to incarceration, and in the reentry context, you had some data before, Jackie, about reducing revocation. So that's a real sort of not going back to prison. That's an alternative. But there's this big question about how does this discussion, what Judge Gertner encouraged us to do is think about how this discussion feeds into the discussions about incarceration, sentences, and probation. So if anybody wants a brief observation on her challenge to us before we open it up to everyone else, I'd encourage you. Yeah.
I'll try to do this in a minute. So there's a couple things. One of them is victims. I think a lot of judges I've known, a lot of people I've known in law enforcement and just in the community. And what about the victims? How does doing all of this stuff for the people who are convicted of the crimes really address the needs of the victims? And I think that's a challenge that these programs have, and I think they're trying to deal with it. I mean, the good ones are, and we're going to hear about restorative justice later. But I think that's a big question mark. You have to get to this issue about what about the victims, and then there's also just this, and it's in our culture, like going back thousands of years, the idea of punishment, right? And so somebody does something really bad to somebody else, do you throw a bunch of social work services at them? I mean, is that the correct response? Or maybe it's some combination of those things. But I think these are the questions we have to wrestle with as we go forward.
Any other observations about where we're headed here?
I mean, I think we need just like we're questioning, is a prison sentence for retribution? Is it for deterrence? Is it for punishment? Is it for public safety? We need to have the same conversation about probation. Is the purpose of probation to track somebody and catch them when they do wrong? Is it to support them so that they can do well? Is it a combination of the two? And I think we haven't had that conversation in the probation field for a long time, or at least it hasn't been a national conversation. Certainly it's happened at an agency level at times. I was at the New York City Probation Department for some years, and we really thought about how do we redefine, we talk about cultural change, our approach to probation as an agency. So it's not a matter of kicking the risk upstream and bringing that revocation back to the judge every time somebody messes up because they mess up, because progress isn't linear, but rather, how are we supporting them by connecting them to resources, to services, to opportunities in their communities so that they're able to do well? We track them, we supervise for some period of time, and when they're doing well and they're like, oh, they've got this now, we can get out of the way.
Any 1-minute observations about how this conversation relates to those bigger questions? Jackie?
I mean, I think that these are all valid concerns, whether it's victims, the role of probation, et cetera. What I personally throw out there as a prosecutor is what works. At the end of the day, what deters crime, what brings down the numbers, what doesn't increase the budget so much that it's impossible, and what actually works. And we've proven it for over 15 years that this model of reentry works.
As we heard at the outset, we know a lot about what doesn't work, which is, we had a discussion yesterday about stacking. Long sentences, very long sentences, have almost no crime control.
Just briefly, one critique we get often is, you got to scale this up. Why don't you make it available to everybody? And the response is, well, we can't do that. But what we can do is a lot of the programming we see it as an incubator, and the general population in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania has benefited greatly from our initiatives. And we've also opened 2 other specialty courts in the Eastern District modeled on what we've done in reentry. One's a front-end court for folks that have mental health issues, and one's a back-end court for folks that have serious addiction issues. So these programs are being scaled up. You have to be careful how you scale them up, but most importantly, it's the culture change that Jackie referenced. And revocations in the Eastern District are down some 40% since we started this program.
So my hope is we have microphones that are going to find whoever. Are you raising your hand because you have a microphone, or do you have a question? Where are the microphones? Okay. We've got one here, one way in the back, and we'll see short questions, short answers. We want to get a lot of conversation here. Yes. And please identify yourself, because we're trying to create community here.
I think, Jeremy, you're pointing at me. Miriam Krinsky with Fair and Just Prosecution. Over here, Judge Restrepo. Okay, or not. To your right, Judge Restrepo. So I think I want to ask all of you to think for a moment, and I think Judge Fogel and Brent, your comments kind of laid this out. How do we really start to move and enact that paradigm shift where we're not, as we think about the future, talking about alternatives to incarceration, but really alternatives to punishment? And we do so much to study the impact of reform, but how do we really, again, change the paradigm where we're studying and quantifying the damage done by the status quo? The cost of incarceration. I mean, Judge Restrepo's former partner, Larry Krasner, has every young prosecutor stand up and talk about the cost of incarceration as a factor at sentencing. But how do we think about the cost of trauma, the cost and damage done of the system? So we're moving to a different starting point.
Got it. I'm going to ask one of our panelists to take a stab at that, because we want to get lots of questions in. Costs of status quo, how do we think about that?
Defer to the Department of Justice.
I'm going to
Department
defer
of
to
Justice.
PDAG.
I mean, I think this is a huge question. How do we, researchers have struggled with this. I think it's something that we talk quite a bit about and know that we need to be able to, in some way, quantify or at least qualify what those impacts are. So point is well taken.
What I'll say about your example of Krasner, at Arnold, we funded him, his office, to do research to examine the impact of his prosecutorial policies regarding sentencing and bail. And he calculates the amount of days saved and therefore the amount of money saved for the changes in those policies. It's on his website. You probably know that already. You can take a look at it. Okay, microphone, please. Where's the microphone? Can you come down here? Or is that too far? You have a microphone. I'm sorry.
Have a microphone. Hi, Lori Magid, a 30-year prosecutor. I am one of Jack Romero's AUSAs, and I've had the great privilege of serving in Judge Restrepo's reentry court. And I want to pick up on something, Jeremy, that I think maybe you were alluding to here, and ask Judge Restrepo to share with folks.
It's rare we have 2 Jeremys on the panel, so you can
I know. I mean, Jack spoke so eloquently about the impact that the Star Court has on the participants in it and on the community. But Judge Restrepo, I want to ask you whether there's been a more diffuse or intangible impact on you and the other judges in terms of sentencing all the 99% of people that never get to be in the program. Has just exposure to the program really impacted how judges in the Eastern District think about sentencing all the other people that they're not necessarily ever going to see in Star?
Great question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that on behalf of the judges, but I do think that there's more of a sense of empathy in the district than there was prior to this program, and I just want to give Lori a shout out. It's another example of a partnership. Lori's husband runs a very successful business. He's hired a few of our guys.
Good. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm trying to
Good morning.
follow the mobile mic. Where is it now?
Oh, I'm over here. Thank you.
There you are.
Hi,
You
good
waved
morning.
at us.
This is a comment. First of all, I am Judge Ginger Lerner Wren from Broward County, Florida, and the pioneer of the first mental health court in the United States. Over 26 years ago, I'm also an adjunct professor for forensic psychology and criminal justice. And I just wanted to thank you, first of all, Jeremy, for your leadership years ago on the National Research Council for the report of the growth of incarceration in the U.S., exploring causes and consequences. I've used that for so many years, and every day in my courtroom I talk about parsimony. And I do, and it is thrilling. It is absolutely thrilling to be able to actually apply, correct, the work of
Okay,
the
you have a question? Enough
I
self-promotion.
will.
Yeah.
No, I really wanted just to say that.
Yeah.
And I think just comment on the fact that I do think that we are in a tremendous paradigm shift across the country because of all of these problem-solving courts and alternative types of restorative justice principles, and that the application of therapeutic jurisprudence and procedural justice is very, very important.
Great.
Thank
And,
you.
Judge Wren is on a panel later, so you go see her. I want to make sure we get a mic down front. We're privileging the people in the back, which is fine, but we have two very insistent waves down here that I want to honor, at least one of them. There we go. You can do it.
First of all, thank you for what you're doing in your district, and I do hope that...
And you are just identified.
Oh, sorry. My name is Lena Spejo, and I'm just an advocate, so I wanted to thank you for what you're doing in your district. I hope that other districts will follow. My question actually is for the commissioner. Since the November 1st information has come out, I have a lot of questions from people that I help on the inside. Hopefully you can clarify something for me. If someone at sentencing was able to get, say, a variance or a departure on their sentence, or they got less time than was asked for in their PSR, is that still a chance for them to get the 2 points? Or because they got less at sentencing, have they already got the benefit, so to speak?
I think that's going to be tethered to whether or not the 2 points would have impacted on the back end. So you have to recalculate the pre-sentence report and take a look at the sentence imposed.
So I just got the time's up sign, which I'm going to disregard. If only, Alan, because we got a slightly late start. Do you have a really quick question?
Quick question.
And we guarantee a quick answer, okay?
I'm Jackie Purcell from Evolution Reentry.
You have a quick question.
What the barrier I have with running a reentry company is that on the standard conditions of release, another felon cannot speak to another felon. So I have probation officers denying, I have support groups, denying some individuals to come to support versus other individuals. I love for that to be a blanket, go away.
Well, we actually encourage it in terms of networking. In other words, one of the incentives we have, if participant A gets participant B a job, they get extra credit towards graduation. We encourage positive networking, and you're going to have to talk to the individual probation officers. There's no way you're going to get rid of that across the board. Sorry.
Great. I've been told by my minder that you have a question. So.
Yeah, so I'm gonna one time the whole summit I'll invoke MC prerogative. Yeah, I have a question, and I hope I won't be considered to be woo-woo if I ask it. If it was up to me, and it wasn't, I would have called this entire summit Alternatives to Incarceration Consistent with Public Safety. Because public safety is what it's all about. We think about that differently now than we used to. My question is, are there crimes or categories of crimes, and I direct this to our two Justice Department representatives, Are there crimes or categories of crimes that are, generally speaking, not appropriate for alternatives to incarceration? And if so, what are those crimes?
Thanks, Alan. That was really Small
You're
question.
definitely putting me on the spot, but most violent crimes, I think we would put in that category where people are harmed in that way. I'm not here to say that every crime is a candidate for alternatives to incarceration. That's not my position as a U.S. attorney, and it's not the Department of Justice's position. There are horrific crimes, and there are victims who have been through some horrible things, and we will always pursue those cases, and we will always look for incarceration in those kinds of matters. So I don't want to ruin the buzz in the room that we're having talking about alternatives, but at the end of the day, my job is to be a prosecutor and to take care of public safety, as you say, and also take care of victims. So.
Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel for a great discussion.
Got you off the hook.
For better or for worse.
So that's you off the hook.